March 6, 1944. Clear skies over Berlin. At 28,000 feet, Major Hans Kogler of the Luftwaffe recorded the outside temperature on his panel, 40 degrees Celsius. The cold was not new, but what was ahead was. In the opposite direction of the sun, crossing the Reich airspace, came formations of heavy bombers, escorted by single-engine fighters. A few months earlier, German generals had been laughing at general staff meetings when they heard rumors that Allied fighter jets were crossing Germany. "Aerodynamics is not a rumor," said an air intelligence colonel. "They have no reach, it's physically impossible." This certainty was about to become obsolete, because the fighters that appeared there, over the capital of the Third Reich, were not legends. They were Mustangs. This video reveals how a single American fighter model, propelled by British engines, paper tanks, and mass production, broke through an entire air doctrine and disarmed the Luftwaffe's last argument of superiority. What the Germans called the technical limit, the Americans called the project. And when the first Mustang crossed the skies of Berlin, the war was no longer a contest of bravery. It was an accounting of capacity. The Luftwaffe was still flying, but the victory had already changed owners. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any testimonial or image. In just 12 months, the Luftwaffe lost 90% of its fuel production, more than half of its experienced pilots, and with them, any hope of holding back the advance of Allied bombers. The German sky, which for years was the exclusive domain of the Nazi Eagle, was invaded by a generation of fighters that shouldn't be there. They were too fast, too far-reaching, and appeared in places that defied all the laws calculated by the Reich General Staff. What the Germans called the technical limit, the Americans called the logistical plan. And this is the story of how a theoretical impossibility turned into an operational routine, a routine that broke the pride of an empire. If you value real history, serious research, and behind-the-scenes narratives of the war, consider signing up and leaving your support. It allows us to continue bringing to light the forgotten details that shaped the course of the century. From the beginning of the war, the Luftwaffe High Command cultivated an almost religious certainty. Allied single-engine fighters would never cross the heart of the Reich. Berlin, Leipzig, Regensburg, these cities were considered safe for a mathematical reason. German engineers, respected worldwide for their accuracy, rigorously calculated that no single-engine aircraft could fly from England to central Germany, escort bombers, and still return safely. To do so, huge external tanks would be needed, which would compromise aerodynamics or engines with unrealistically low consumption. In both cases, the conclusion was the same. It was not feasible. This confidence was translated into doctrine. The Luftwaffe focused its efforts on shooting down heavy bombers, believing that on their own, they would always come unprotected. The absence of escort was a constant that shaped all German air defense, tactics, fighter positioning, flak distribution, interceptor design. In the Reich's strategic vision, it was enough to resist the flow of B-17s until the political will of the Allies was exhausted. But what was not calculated was that the American doctrine did not obey German limits. While Berlin calculated what was theoretically possible, Detroit manufactured what was technically necessary. In 1943, U.S. aircraft production exceeded 85,000 units, more than triple that of Germany in the same period. What German engineers dismissed as unfeasible, American industry accepted as a challenge. Instead of trying to design a miracle fighter, the Allies invested in modular, adaptable logistical solutions. Instead of looking for perfection in a prototype, they looked for efficiency in thousands. The Reich's air doctrine was not just based on numbers, it was hostage to them. Göring and his generals believed they had won the war from heaven when they saw the first bombing raids fail for lack of escort. In his words, "Americans bleed on the way and go home crying." What they didn't know was that while the Luftwaffe celebrated every B-17 shot down, the Americans celebrated every piece of data collected. Each mission, even with losses, generated cover maps, flak patterns, safe routes, real consumption in combat. On American soil, engineers adjusted algorithms, changed fuel mixtures, refined aerodynamics. The Mustang was born from this logic. A light aerodynamic fighter with blade wing wings and a British engine that behaved like an American. Fast, direct, and functional. But even with all these improvements, the range was still lacking. The solution came from an unlikely place, from the banality of large-scale production. mass-produced, disposable external tanks made of resin-impregnated paper. Light, cheap, and enough to double the range of the P-51. They were ugly, fragile, and hated by German pilots who saw them as a violation of the rules of engineering. But they worked. In February 1944, the first Mustangs equipped with paper tanks crossed the skies of the Ruhr, and contrary to what German calculations predicted, they returned. The German mistake was not technical, it was cultural. The Luftwaffe's air warfare doctrine was based on the conviction that the war would be won with technological supremacy, advanced prototypes, faster aircraft, superior weaponry. But he ignored that. In long wars, it is logistics that define the final line. American production of jet fuel, for example, was almost 10 times greater than Germany's in 1944. That's right, 10 times. The Luftwaffe didn't just underestimate the range of enemy fighters, it underestimated the scale of the war it faced. And if this difference in proportions surprised you, leave a comment with "logistics wins." We want to know how many here understood the real dimension of this conflict. On maps and conferences, the distance between London and Berlin was a wall, but for American planners it was an extended airstrip. While the Germans protected their factories with the conviction that no one would get here, the Americans prepared the way with warehouse precision. Every ton of fuel, every maintenance schedule, every production shift in Detroit was an invisible step toward the impossible. And then one day, this impossible happened. At 10:32 a.m., on a routine reconnaissance flight over Saxony, 3 FW-190s detected movement at an altitude of 12,000 meters. When the binoculars confirmed, the radio was muted for seconds. "They're Mustangs," said the lead driver, "and they're flying west." What he didn't know was that this course indicated something even more frightening. The American fighters were already coming back. The mission in Berlin had already taken place, and no German knew how to stop it. In the next chapter, we will see how a bloody failure of American aviation, known as Black Thursday, forced Allied command to rewrite its tactics, paving the way for the definitive arrival of Mustangs in the skies over Germany. Because before the victory came the pain, and it was the fuel of the revolution. During the war, Germany was betting on brains, the United States, in systems. This philosophical difference, imperceptible in the early years of the conflict, became stark when the combat extended beyond the expected limits. The German model valued individual genius, technical excellence, and craftsmanship. Every fighter engine, every weapon system, every airplane airframe was treated as a superior work of engineering, detailed, customized, finely tuned. This worked in laboratories and showcases, but not in 3-round, 7-day-a-week wars. On the other side of the Atlantic, the Americans operated as a living line of production, adaptable, redundant, and scale-driven. Its engineers weren't looking for the perfect design. They were looking for the design that could be reproduced 10,000 times with the slightest margin of error. This is how the Packard Motor Car Company from Detroit received the license to manufacture the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. In a matter of months, what was an English engineering gem became a block of mass-cast steel with exacting tolerances and interchangeable parts. An engine that took weeks to assemble in Coventry started to roll off the American line every 30 minutes. And with it, the Mustang gained not only power, it gained war breath. While German engineers hand-tuned each component of their Daimler-Benz engines, American workers assembled hundreds of V1650s with an accuracy margin of less than 0.02 millimeters. It was not just about raw power, but about constancy. An American engine might not be more advanced, but it was replicable. When it broke, it was replaced. When damaged, there was already another one in transit. Pilots noticed. Mustangs rarely needed adjustments between flights. German fighters, even the legendary Bf-109 and FW-190, went through long maintenance sessions between each mission, consuming time, parts, and technical personnel that Germany was already beginning to lose. And this contrast extended to the philosophy of combat itself. Luftwaffe fighters were designed for individual performance, winning duels, performing extreme maneuvers, achieving local supremacy. But the Mustang was designed as part of an ecosystem. It was a cog that worked within a system of precision bombing, radio communications, ground refueling, standardized maintenance, meteorological intelligence, and intercontinental logistics. While Berlin designed machines to challenge physical limits, Washington designed machines to obey industrial limits. The American pilot was a vector of a network, the German pilot, a lone gladiator. This difference would be costly. By 1943, the United States was producing more than 25,000 aircraft engines per quarter. Germany, even with its superior technical capacity per unit, could not keep up with the pace, producing, on average, less than 4,000 engines per month. And there was something even more critical. American engines arrived where they were needed. The railroad network, the cargo ships, the prepared airfields, the mobile workshops. Everything followed an almost clinical distribution plan. In Germany, bombed day after day, every delivery was a risky operation. Engines were stuck in warehouses, parts were lost, trucks were intercepted. The American gear was turning, the German creaked. And perhaps the cruelest symbol of this difference was the Mustang itself, a fighter initially underestimated by the Allies themselves, hastily adapted, reused from parts and concepts, which ended up surpassing all competitors. His story is not one of sudden genius. It is one of constant adjustment. Early models had limited range, unstable stability, and light armament. In less than a year, they were already escorting bombers to Romania. With each flight, a form. With each problem, a modification. With each returning pilot, a design lesson. Germany, stuck to its doctrine, saw change as a risk. America, a process. And it was this process that led her to victory. Because more than winning battles, the United States has learned to produce victories. With stopwatches, tables, tools, and anonymous workers. And while the world was still watching the Messerschmitt dance in the skies, Detroit already knew, whoever won at the dice would win in the air. In the next episode, we'll look at how a simple invention, a paper tank, was the key to solving the biggest operational dilemma in escort aviation. A solution as cheap as it is offensive by German engineering standards. But that changed the scope of the war. Literally. In 1943, the biggest obstacle to long-range escort wasn't firepower, nor the speed of fighters. It was time. Or, more precisely, the flight autonomy. The P-51 Mustangs, while fast, agile, and lethal, were still stuck with the same limitation as all single-engine fighters in the world. Range. It was possible to escort bombers to the outskirts of the Rhine, but never cross the central German barrier and return. And so, the Luftwaffe's doctrine remained intact. Even the best enemy fighters would have to turn back before the target. But in some British laboratory, an engineer looked at this dilemma with different eyes. Instead of trying to create a more advanced fuel tank, he proposed the opposite, a simpler one. Then came the idea of disposable external tanks made of paper impregnated with phenolic resin. Lightweight, inexpensive, tough enough to hold hundreds of gallons of high-octane fuel during flight, and disposable as soon as emptied. No metal parts, no recovery, no repurposing. To the German eye, it was a technical offense, but in the American eye, it was logistical efficiency. These tanks were produced by the thousands, stacked like cardboard boxes, assembled in a few minutes, and disposed of with a pull of a lever. The Mustang flew to Berlin, dropped the tanks on the way, and fought lightly. The enemy, seeing him, did not understand how he got so far, and still fought with such vigor. The answer was below, on the soil of the factories. While the Luftwaffe invested in metallic, reusable, craftsman-welded, and precision-balanced auxiliary tanks, the Allies accepted logistical losses in exchange for strategic gains. Each tank discarded was the price paid for operational continuity. A paper tank cost less than a machine gun, but it knocked down defenses worth millions. In 1944, the United States alone produced more than 350,000 external tanks for fighters and bombers. Germany, which considered this type of consumption an industrial heresy, could not maintain production even of its fixed models. The difference was brutal. While the Luftwaffe maintained the philosophy of every resource must last, the Allies operated with the logic of every resource must work. And it worked. American crews called paper tanks disposable wings, an affectionate nickname for a strategic workaround. They knew they flew far, not by magic, but by calculation. The war had ceased to be a dispute between engineers and had become a battle between philosophical decisions. The Germans preserved materials. The Americans preserved pilots. The Germans optimized the machine. The Americans optimized the system. And in the end, what seemed inferior was exactly what won. An airplane that flies with paper tanks represents more than innovation. It represents humility in the face of scale. It represents courage to abandon the ideal and embrace the functional. It represents the moment when the industry stopped trying to win in the duel of machines and started to win in the statistics of continuity. When Mustangs began to appear over Berlin, Luftwaffe engineers were called upon to explain the impossible. They found no answer. Their calculations, all correct, failed in the face of a variable they had never considered, giving up reuse. And this error of judgment was not limited to paper. It was repeated throughout the German military apparatus. The Reich built tanks that could not be repaired in the field, planes that required perfect runways, weapons that relied on rare metals. The United States, on the contrary, standardized it. From motors to screws, everything was made to be assembled, used, and replaced. It was the opposite of elegance, and for that very reason it was the triumph. When a Mustang dropped 2 empty tanks into a German forest and repositioned for combat as if nothing had happened, the war changed languages. It left elite engineering and entered popular production. And in this new language, there was no possible translation for the word untouchable, because now the skies of Germany were accessible, and not because of a secret weapon, but of an operational choice that seemed banal. In the next chapter, we'll look at how an unexpected massacre in the sky over Europe forced the United States to revise its entire air strategy, and how this trauma further accelerated the adoption of Mustangs as the ultimate escort force. Because before glory came Black Thursday. On the morning of October 14, 1943, more than 290 B-17 bombers took off from bases in England for Germany, with a clear objective: to destroy the ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, the heart of the Reich's mechanical industry. It was the second attempt to neutralize this vital complex. The first, 2 months earlier, had already been bloody, but this would become known as Black Thursday. Without adequate escort, the bombers advanced alone, relying on the tight formation, heavy armor, and brutal cadence of their 50 machine guns. American doctrine still believed in mass self-defense, but on that day, the Luftwaffe came with everything. More than 300 German fighters attacked in successive waves. Bf-109s and Fw-190s dived through the clouds, broke through the sides, cut the squadrons like steel blades in a wall of flesh. In just a few hours, 60 bombers were shot down. Nearly 600 crew members died or went missing. Another 5,000 airmen were launched into emotional freefall. For every B-17 lost, 4 Mustangs would have been enough, but they weren't there. And not because they didn't exist, but because they didn't reach it yet. The pain of that day went through the chain of command like a shrapnel. Generals, engineers, and politicians were forced to face the mistake head-on. Insisting on deep bombardments without escort was technical and moral suicide. For the first time, the doctrine of the invulnerability of the flying fortresses has been called into question, and it was there that the revolution began. The trauma has not paralyzed the United States. On the contrary, it catalyzed a complete transformation. Within weeks, industrial priority was redirected to adapting Mustangs to long-range missions. Expendable tanks were approved, versions with Merlin engines were given top priority, and a new concept of air warfare began to emerge, one in which every bomb dropped would have a fighter at its side, going back and forth. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them all along. It was enough to adapt. It was enough to accept that the logic of the war had changed. And if you're enjoying unraveling these facts and understanding how mistakes turn into revolutions, show your support. Like the video and subscribe so we can continue reconstructing these behind-the-scenes stories with precision and depth. Black Thursday was not just any defeat. It was the turning point. From then on, each Mustang produced ceased to be an airplane and became an answer, a promise that it would never happen again, and he did not repeat it. In the next chapter, we will see how, even in the face of mounting evidence, the Luftwaffe command ignored the first signs that something had changed, and how this willful blindness paved the way for the absolute shock that was to come over Berlin. At the end of December 1943, a Luftwaffe patrol was flying over the Kassel region when, amid the distant hum of enemy engines, 2 pilots spotted a scene that was out of tune with everything they had learned in the academy. In the distance, 3 single-engine fighters escorted a formation of bombers. But the detail that froze the blood of the observers was the direction. The fighters were not coming back. They were advancing. The major in charge recorded the sighting in the mission report, adding a personal note. They must be modified P-47s or perhaps Spitfires off course. At the Berlin barracks, the document was filed with a marginal notation. Probable misidentification. Ignore. The doctrine was clear. There was no Allied single-engine aircraft with sufficient range for this depth. Therefore, if a pilot claimed to have seen one, it was the pilot who was wrong. In the following months, the reports increased. Sightings over Leipzig, isolated raids near Merseburg, brief sightings over factories north of Frankfurt. In all cases, veteran pilots recorded the same pattern. Silver, fast fighters with an unknown aerodynamic profile, accompanying bombers and disappearing shortly after the engagement. But the command ignored it. For the Luftwaffe, this was technically impossible, and by definition, what was impossible could not be happening. Some bolder officers began to question this logic. At a meeting of the 3rd Air Corps, a captain brought photographic records with suspicious silhouettes. He was silenced by his immediate superior. "We are not going to feed ghosts. The Allies don't have that capability." Another pilot, a veteran of the Eastern Front, insisted to his commanders that new fighters were being used. He was punished with a transfer to a training unit, accused of technical alarmism. The German war machine, which had so often been extolled for efficiency, was now blind from within. The problem was not a lack of information, it was what was done with it. The system valued calculations, not eyes, the roles, not the experiences. And in that chasm between the battlefield and the command offices, the Mustang thrived. In the United States, each field report was analyzed by entire teams. A pilot who spotted something strange generated a report. The report became an adjustment of doctrine. The adjustments were implemented at scale. The American war was made of feedbacks, the German of immutable orders. By the time the Reich High Command finally admitted that something was changing, it was too late. The Mustangs were already not only going further, they were coming back with minimal losses. The German model of hunting and retreat, based on short interceptions and localized maneuvers, was beginning to crumble in the face of a force that fought with range, discipline, and numbers. And yet Berlin hesitated. Air intelligence reports, increasingly accurate, pointed to the systematic presence of Mustangs over the interior of the country. But the commanders insisted, if the Americans were doing this, we would already know. The phrase was repeated with conviction. What they did not realize was that the war they knew was being replaced by a new one. A war where the impossible was already routine, and where doctrinal arrogance was more lethal than any bomb. The collapse didn't start with a defeat. It started with a refusal. Refusal to see. Refusal to listen. Refusal to change. In the next chapter, we will look at what happened when refusal met reality. The day when Mustangs appeared, en masse on Berlin's radars, and the Luftwaffe finally realized that it had underestimated not one plane, but an entire system. On the morning of March 6, 1944, the radio at Luftwaffe headquarters in Wunstorf was broadcasting routine alerts. Heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force had crossed the English Channel and were heading for the industrial heartland of the Reich. Nothing out of the norm, at least at first glance. But at 9:57 a.m., the radar operator at the Staaken station interrupted the usual flow with a tone of hesitation. A new echo appeared in the sky above Brandenburg. Small, fast spots, flying alongside the bombers but beyond the line where any single-engine fighter should be. The senior officer asked for confirmation. Check the signature. It must be red error. It wasn't. It was what the reports had warned about, and what no one wanted to hear. Mustangs. About Berlin. At 10:12 a.m., the skies over the German capital were cut by more than 600 B-17 and B-24 bombers, divided into multiple formations, supported by about 100 escort fighters. But the surprise was close behind. More than 100 P-51 Mustangs, silver, fast, serene, danced among the clouds at higher altitude. They flew in wide formation, protecting the flanks of the bombers with a precision that seemed rehearsed. For the German drivers, it was like seeing ghosts, not just because the Mustangs weren't supposed to be there, but because they were calm. They did not run, did not retract, did not run away at first contact. They were where the German engineers said it was impossible. And if they were there, then the entire aerial model of the Reich had just collapsed. Major Hans Kogler of Jagdgeschwader 11 took off from Rechlin at 09:45. It climbed to 25,000 feet and found the enemy group already in combat position. The bombers were protected by light fighters. I didn't understand what I saw. My instruments said we were over Potsdam, but my eyes said we were on another continent. He tried to maneuver, but before he completed the turn, a Mustang went underneath, climbing an upward curve and firing 3 short bursts. The FW-190 next to it exploded. The radio went silent. It was as if the air had been drained from the Reich. The communication systems were disorganized under the speed of events. In the command towers, officers shouted codes as they sought to confirm what was already visible through the windows. Germany's skies had been breached, not by bombers, by fighters. At 10:38 a.m., a scuba diving they machine-gunned hangars, fuel trucks, and auxiliary runways. The operation was simultaneous with the industrial bombardment. It wasn't improvisation. It was part of the plan. For the first time, Allied fighters didn't just escort. They attacked secondary targets, cleared defenses, imposed logistical panic. On land, the German technicians ran in circles, delayed refueling, aborted takeoffs, pilots without guidance. Meanwhile, the Mustangs were on their course, protecting the bombers and clearing the return path. A civilian witness reported, "The planes flew in pairs without hesitation. Our people barely rose. It was as if we didn't know how to fly anymore." In the Berlin bunker, Hermann Göring received confirmation of the attack at 11:02 a.m. Witnesses say he was silent for almost a minute. Then he muttered a phrase that would become legendary among Luftwaffe survivors. "When I saw American fighter jets over Berlin, I knew we had lost the war." That day was not just a tactical defeat. It was the death of a doctrine. The Luftwaffe's defensive model, based on denial of deep escort, disappeared in one morning. The Reich now knew. What had once been considered the inviolable center was just another dot on the American flight map. The Luftwaffe had lost 69 fighters that day, but the biggest loss was invisible: trust. And the cruelest thing was the method. The Mustangs did not fight with hatred, but with precision. Each action was the result of logistics that worked, training that responded, an industry that delivered. That was what Berlin saw. Not just airplanes, but the flying portrait of a nation organized to win. In the next chapter, we'll look at how the Luftwaffe tried desperately to respond to the new threat, and how each attempt revealed, in effect, that the time for reaction had passed. Because when the mistake is recognized, the opponent is already 2 phases ahead. With Mustangs firmly established in the skies over Germany, what began as a tactical advantage quickly turned into a chain reaction of strategic proportions. The change was invisible to the eyes of many German commanders, but devastating behind the scenes of the Reich's war machine. The new full escort capability allowed Allied bombers to hit targets once thought immune: synthetic fuel plants, liquid hydrogen plants, engine repair centers, railroad depots. And for the first time, these operations were accompanied by fighters that not only protected the main mission, but swept the secondary routes, strafed ground transports, and hunted targets of opportunity with brutal efficiency. The impact was immediate. Between March and June 1944, the Leuna, Politz, and Blechhammer plants operated, on average, at less than 20% of their capacity. Aviation kerosene began to run out. Veteran pilots flew less, training units were suspended, and newly produced fighters were parked for lack of fuel. And here's the data that best sums up this collapse. In just 6 months, the Reich's aviation fuel production fell by more than 90%. That's right, 90%. Leave a word in the comments that represents this shock. It can be shocking data, absolute power, or simply logistics wins. We want to know how many here have understood the real scale of this rupture. The domino effect did not stop there. The Luftwaffe, already weakened by human losses, was now suffering a collapse of mobility. Maintenance units received no parts, engine trains were intercepted, hangars filled with inoperative aircraft. Even the legendary FW-190 and Me-262, the result of the most advanced German engineering, became easy prey without logistical support. And it all started with a simple change in range. The Mustang wasn't just a fighter jet. It was the visible tip of an invisible system. Wherever he arrived, he paved the way for the entire American apparatus to act efficiently. Air intelligence, precision bombing, logistical sabotage. Each mission escorted by the P-51 was a vector of paralysis for the Reich. And as the days wore on, the Luftwaffe began to feel an irreversible void, not only in the skies, but in the depots, in the refueling stations, in the instruction rooms. Germany flew less, trained less, responded less. And contrary to what was said in war propaganda, the problem was not in the morale, it was in the barrels. In the next chapter, we'll dive behind the scenes of Allied factories and reveal how, While Germany was calculating grams of fuel per flight, the United States was delivering tons of engines, weapons, and parts every day, as if it were supplying a store, not a war front. Because American secrecy was never just in the field, it was in the rear guard that never failed. By July 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer operating as an air force. It was operating as a reflection of what it had been, with rationed fuel, inexperienced pilots, and aircraft without spare parts. The former Reich Eagle flew low, slow, and afraid. Meanwhile, P-51 Mustangs crossed the skies of Germany with unprecedented freedom. They no longer flew just to protect bombers. Now, they hunted. The concept of air superiority, maintaining air dominance over the battlefield, had been outdated. What the Americans now practiced was air supremacy, unfettered freedom of action, anywhere, anytime, without meaningful opposition. The difference was brutal. Mustangs started the day escorting bombers but ended up scouring enemy soil on free hunting missions. They attacked locomotives with 50 rounds, destroyed supply columns, targeted ammunition depots, disrupted bridges, machine-gunned airstrips, hit planes still on the ground even before takeoff. It was a campaign of logistical annihilation. The Luftwaffe, with its doctrine of point interception, never imagined facing an air force capable of multiplying targets by opportunity. And yet, there they were, flying in pairs, scouring railroads, cutting telegraph cables, blocking vital tracks. The German reports of the time begin to change tone. From report of enemy sighting, they become constant presence alert. A general staff officer wrote in August 1944, "The enemy fighters no longer come in response. They come out of habit." In other words, Mustangs had become routine. And when air terror becomes routine, war becomes statistics. Each day, fewer trains completed their routes. Fewer units arrived at the front with full armaments. Fewer recruits received full training. The Luftwaffe reacted with what it had: few aircraft, hastily trained pilots, and what was left of its air intelligence. But it was no longer a question of combat. It was about survival. The German technical advantage, once represented by complex maneuvers and superior aircraft in turns or dives, was now irrelevant. There was not enough fuel to engage, and when there was, the engagement lasted minutes. The Mustangs operated with autonomy, efficient communications, optimized routes, and above all, replenishment. Every downed Mustang was replaced. Each fallen pilot was replaced. Each thwarted mission was improved. The enemy, on the contrary, erased his mistakes with tombstones. There was no second chance. It was an irreversible movement. The Luftwaffe stopped flying to attack and started flying to avoid humiliation. Some commanders even hid aircraft in forests, painted them with makeshift camouflage, changed bases daily, but the Mustangs always found them. And when they did, they didn't attack urgently. They attacked with method, because now, the P-51s were not just fighting to make way for bombers. They fought to erase the possibility of reaction. They were the razor on the pulse of German logistics. Supremacy was not a metaphor. It was the physical reality of the battlefield. In 1944, Allied troops were advancing on European soil while the sky above already belonged to another owner. In the next chapter, we will reveal how this absolute dominance allowed the Allies to decide not only where to strike, but when, how, and with what intensity. And how for the first time war began to be calculated by tonnage and flight interval, because whoever controlled the time between bombings controlled the end of the war. By September 1944, the average lifespan of a new Luftwaffe pilot on the Western Front had dropped to a staggering 11 days. The number was not a miscalculation. It was the brutal sum of improvisation, scarcity, and despair. With fuel reserves collapsing and the logistics chain fragmented, training for new pilots has been drastically shortened. What used to take 12 months now lasts, in some cases, only 6 weeks. Young people of 17, 18 years old were coming out of civilian schools and, in less than 2 months, were flying obsolete fighters against Mustangs. Most had barely fired a machine gun in real flight. On land, graduation ceremonies were replaced by hurried instructions. Take off, climb to 5,000 meters, intercept, shoot, and come back, if possible. For many, the "if possible" was the most honest part of the order. The available planes, Bf-109s and FW-190s of the first series, were exhausted, with flight hours far above the recommended and poor maintenance. Replacement units, once cared for by meticulous engineers, now operated with repurposed parts, and inexperienced crews. The result was inevitable: mechanical failures in combat, inaccurate commands, uncalibrated radars. On the other side of the sky, Mustangs were operated by veterans, pilots who had fought over North Africa, Italy, the English Channel, men with 50, 60, 70 missions complete, flying machines fresh out of the factory, fueled with high-octane fuel, connected to efficient radio systems, guided by accurate aerial intelligence. It was an asymmetrical massacre. In the words of Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Steinbrenner, one of the few survivors of the final generation of German riders, it was like facing a platoon of tanks on a bicycle. We couldn't win, but we had to take off, and they took off. Each mission became a sentence, not for cowardice, but for statistics. The Luftwaffe no longer taught how to win, only how to die with honor. Many flew without a co-pilot, without coverage, without an emergency plan. Some didn't even know how to operate the radio properly. Others were shot down before they even saw the enemy. By 1944, the casualty rate in combat missions exceeded 60% among recent graduates, and those who returned silently. The classic Luftwaffe tactics, diving, evading, coordinated, were useless against what they found in the sky. The Mustangs came from above, they came in pairs, they came organized. Every German move was predicted, rehearsed, neutralized. The superiority wasn't just in the wings, it was in the thinking behind the mission. And even the most daring Reich pilots, such as the veterans of JG-26 and JG-54, began to avoid direct confrontation. There was no longer any merit in shooting down a Mustang. There was a risk in surviving the day. The Reich, which once formed aces with 200 victories, now sent boys to die in the first combat. The German sky became a silent slaughterhouse where bravery was swallowed up by the logic of production. And the cruelest thing is that there was no alternative. German youth were sacrificed not for lack of courage, but for overbelief in a system that did not adapt. The enemy changed every month. The Luftwaffe did not. And with each pilot shot down, it wasn't just one man who fell. It was an entire generation of technical, tactical, and moral heirs who disappeared with him. In the next chapter, we'll dive into the factory behind this chasm, the American production chain. We will reveal how the United States, with ruthless logistics and standardization, built not only serial airplanes, but also the replacement of pilots, parts, and fuel, as if they were part of the same organism. Because while the Reich burned its youth, America fueled its machine. And she didn't stop. In the diaries rescued after the war, what is most striking is not the heroism or the anger, it is the silence. A dense silence, interspersed with short, resigned sentences from those who no longer expect victory. Oberfeldwebel Heinrich Lawrence, pilot of JG-3, wrote on 2 October 1944, "Today I went to the track with a feeling that I would not return. When I started the engine, I already saw 2 Mustangs orbiting our base. They already knew." This phrase, "they already knew," appears repeatedly in dozens of accounts from the time. The P-51s didn't just dominate space, they anticipated movements. They were always one step ahead. They flew at higher altitudes, appeared before radar, attacked in pairs with almost surgical precision. For German pilots, it was like fighting an invisible force that read their thoughts. Hans-Jürgen Weidlich, then only 19 years old, recorded, "In the first combat I tried to maneuver as I had learned. I went up, I turned, I retreated. Just when I thought I was out of range, I got hit. I didn't hear the shot, I didn't see the enemy. Only the impact. It was like being hunted by a predator that never breathes." The Luftwaffe, which had once formed aces with hundreds of victories, now offered little resistance. The young pilots faced superior fighters led by Allied veterans and with no real chance of return. The feeling of helplessness began to erode the morale of the troops with more force than any bomb. In the letters sent to the families, the tones varied between fatality and bitter irony. "If you write to me, write quickly," read a letter from Dieter Kretschmer, who died 3 days after sending it. "The Americans now meet us before we take off. They are like bees with eyes on all sides." The comparison was exact. The tactical pattern of the Mustangs was coordinated by advanced air intelligence, radio triangulation, and continuous surveillance of strategic targets. On land, outposts received information in near real time. When a German fighter was detected taxiing for takeoff, there was already a Mustang on its way. Free hunting missions began to include patrolling over active airfields, observing movements, and carrying out attacks of opportunity with mathematical precision. Feldwebel Otto Niemann, who survived 3 missions, wrote, "The greatest pain is not the fall, it's the wait. To see the enemy flying over your runway, to know that he is there for you, and to be able to do nothing." The air war was no longer a confrontation between gentlemen of the sky. It became a game of survival in which only one side had all the cards. And it wasn't for lack of courage. Luftwaffe pilots who threw themselves into combat knew their fate. But they also knew that the enemy now possessed something beyond the machine. He possessed the method. In 1944, the United States had more than 250,000 people working only in aviation maintenance, distribution, and logistical training. Each Mustang on mission was underpinned by an ecosystem that monitored, corrected, and adapted. Each mistake was corrected the next day. The Luftwaffe, drained of resources, operated by trial and error cost lives. And yet, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, German pilots maintained a tragic code of honor: fly, even if you knew it. Lieutenant Horst Hartmann's diary, found next to the wreckage of his Bf-109, recorded, "The war is over, but heaven does not yet know it, and until he knows, we will fly." In the next chapter, we will discover how, while Germany counted crashes, the United States counted deliveries, engines, ammunition, complete airplanes, mass-produced with unthinkable precision. Because while one side saw its pilots as sacrificial pieces, the other treated each mission as an end product of a perfect chain. And this difference, more than airplanes, was what decided the air. In the icy skies of Europe, the clash between the Focke-Wulf Fu-190, the Messerschmitt Bf-109, and the North American P-51 Mustang was not just a battle between aircraft, it was the technical mirror of 2 philosophies of war. On the one hand, German engineering, refined, aggressive, built on the logic of individual superiority. On the other, American pragmatism, balanced, efficient, designed to last and be multiplied. The first difference was in the autonomy. The Bf-109, even in its latest versions, rarely exceeded 850 kilometers in range. The FW-190 with auxiliary tanks reached 1,000 km. The P-51D with disposable paper tanks exceeded 2,600 kilometers in real operation. This brutal difference allowed the Mustang to escort bombers to Berlin, engage enemies on the way, patrol secondary areas, and still return without having to land outside its base. In terms of speed, the P-51D reached 703 km/h at altitude, close to the performance of the FW-190A8, 670 km/h, but with better efficiency in cruise flight. Its operational ceiling was 12,800 meters, which allowed it to initiate dive-like attacks with energy superiority. The Germans were always going up, he was always going down. In the field of ergonomics and visibility, the Mustang was a revolution. Its cockpit was wide, equipped with the bubble canopy, allowing full 360-degree vision, a luxury unknown to the pilots of the Bf-109, whose rear fuselage dangerously limited visual perception. The cockpit heating system was also superior, which allowed for long missions at extreme altitudes with less physical wear. The Rolls-Royce Merlin 66 engine, manufactured under license by Packard in the USA, combined power with reliability. On thousands of flights, it had a failure rate of less than 0.4%. This was in contrast to the BMW 801 engine of the FW-190, powerful but sensitive to thermal variations and fuel sabotage, something the Allies exploited in direct attacks on German refineries. The weaponry also reflected the philosophy of use. While the FW-190 was armed with two 20mm MG-151 cannons and two 13mm MG-131 machine guns, and the Bf-109 with similar configurations, the Mustang operated with 6 Browning 50, 12.7mm machine guns, reliable, fast, and with an abundant supply of ammunition. Although less destructive on single impact, the volume and constancy of the shots made the P-51 a relentless firing platform. But perhaps the most definitive data comes from the rate of losses. In 1944, Mustangs had a rate of 1.1 aircraft shot down per 100 missions. The Bf-109 in that same year exceeded 8.5 per 100, a difference of more than 700%. And that statistic sums up the war in numbers. The Mustang wasn't just good, it was viable, reliable, and multipliable. Pause for reflection. In 1944, while Germany produced about 5,000 fighters for the entire year, the United States produced more than 15,000 Mustangs, 3 times more, with greater quality, range, and durability. If this data surprises you, write in the comments, unbelievable, or absolute power. We want to know how many here realize that the war was decided long before the last combat. It was decided in the spreadsheets, and there was also a silent factor, morale. American pilots knew that their plane would return, that there would be parts, support, gasoline, ammunition, that if they fell, there would be rescue. German pilots knew they were flying what was left, with what was left. And this emotional difference, this psychological weight, cannot be measured by numbers, but decided combats, even before takeoff. In the next chapter, we'll get to know the American assembly line from the inside, and understand how it was possible to deliver 300 Mustangs a week, while the Reich struggled to keep the lights on in the underground factories. Because in the end, the machine that wins is the one that never stops. While the world saw in the skies of Europe a battle between fast fighters and valiant pilots, the real war was fought far from the clouds, in factories, drawing boards, and laboratories. The success of the P-51 Mustang was not only the result of the genius of an aerial project, but the end result of an industrial and intellectual chain that transformed the concept of modern warfare. For every Mustang that crossed the Atlantic, there were hundreds of engineers, factory workers, mathematicians, and technicians behind every bolt tightened, every optimized wing curve, every drop of fuel delivered on time. It was the hive mind that won. Mustang's original design was born fast, in less than 120 days, but his excellence came from unseen hands. NACA, NASA's forerunner, tested more than 40 variations of aerodynamic profiles until it found the optimal wing geometry that reduced drag and allowed for long flights with minimal loss of performance. Packard, with its standardized machining processes, adapted the British Merlin engine to the American pace of mass production, maintaining quality with precise tolerance margins. North American aviation structured assembly lines inspired by the Ford model, where each production cell operated as part of a synchronized flow. Nothing was random. Each piece fit together because each mind worked on the same plan, to win through consistency. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe operated under the logic of isolated genius. Each new German fighter, the Me-262, the Tia-152, the He-219, was a prodigy on paper, but a nightmare on the production line. Parts were missing, there was sabotage, and rivalries between Goering, Speer, and the manufacturers undermined efficiency. The engineers knew what to do, but the system didn't allow them to do it. Many state-of-the-art aircraft have not even left the prototype stage. The P-51, on the contrary, flew even before its final version was ready. It was adapted, adjusted, improved in real time, because the engineers were connected to the pilots, who were connected to the commanders, who were connected to the industry. It was a living network, where the error was corrected before it became a catastrophe. By 1944, Ford operated 3 shifts a day at Willow Run, a plant that produced a B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. If this sounds impossible, it is because the Reich never came close to trying. The American war economy didn't just produce more, it produced better with vertical integration, strict standardization, and reverse logistics. When a Mustang was damaged, it was returned, repaired, and put back into service within days. In Germany, many damaged fighters were abandoned due to lack of transport, parts, or simply because it was no longer worth it. What history often romanticizes as overcoming at the front was, in practice, the bankruptcy of a system that despised its own engineers. The Luftwaffe had talent, but no coordination. He had brilliant ideas, but no line capable of making them the rule. The P-51 won not by overwhelming superiority in a single attribute, but because it was good enough in all, and was replicable. This was not the work of chance. It was the victory of planning, pragmatic engineering, of science applied with humility and method. While the Germans designed weapons to win duels, the Americans designed systems to win the war. And every Mustang that flew was, in fact, a letter written by thousands of hands, signed by minds that never fired a machine gun, but calculated the wind, the weight, the time, and the cost. Modern warfare there ceased to be a battlefield to become a supply chain, and the Luftwaffe, stuck in the tradition of the lone hero, has never been able to keep up. In the next chapter, we'll look at how this system mentality led Mustangs to do something even more unlikely: dominate the skies over even the Reich capital, without ever running out of fuel, parts, or pilots. Because those who win a war are not only those who fly better, but those who never stop flying. In March 1944, looking up at the Berlin sky and seeing silvery dots at high altitude, single-engine fighters where, by all Reich estimates, they could never be, Hermann Göring did not speak as an air marshal, but as a vanquished man. "When I saw the Mustangs over the capital," he would later confess in a dry tone, "I knew the war was lost." It was not a dramatic exaggeration. It was the exact realization that the entire air doctrine built by the Luftwaffe, since the 30s, was technically outdated and politically demoralized. The myth of the inviolability of the heart of the Reich had been shattered by airplanes that, until recently, did not even exist in the German military imagination. Göring, the hero of the First World War, the architect of the modern Luftwaffe, saw his empire crumble not under bombardment, but under presence. The Mustang didn't just fly where it shouldn't. It flew with authority, unopposed, protecting bombers that destroyed refineries, railroads, depots, and factories. Each time a B-17 ladder appeared over the Reich, there were Mustangs in front, sideways, above, and behind, and they stayed until the end. This permanence was what dismantled the defensive logic of the Luftwaffe. The German belief was that the natural wear and tear of long-distance flight would limit any Allied fighter. But the Americans didn't just send planes, they sent a solved equation. The Mustang was supplied by continental pipelines, maintained by redundant rail logistics, guided by photographic intelligence, and manned by pilots trained with industrial methodology. Each mission was a cog in a wheel. Göring knew this, and in the famous strategic evaluation meeting, he told his leadership, "We don't lose to pilots, we lose to a machine that never sleeps." The phrase, recorded by officers present, circulated in silence behind the scenes. It wasn't just the end of a war, it was the end of an era. The marshal who had once promised that no enemy would tread the German sky now admitted to his generals that the sky was no longer theirs. And the most humiliating thing was the reason: disposable paper tanks, licensed copied engines, and civilian workers who assembled fighter jets by the thousands. While the Reich bet on miraculous weapons, V2, jet Messerschmitts, secret projects, the Americans invested in constancy, adaptation, and volume. Göring, with his technical arrogance and faith in the German scientific elite, had ignored the signs. It ignored the first reports of Mustangs at the borders. It ignored requests for logistical adaptation. It even ignored the pilots themselves who reported successive losses. When he finally looked up, it was too late. The Mustang flew above the clouds, and its shadow was more symbolic than physical. It represented the defeat of centralized strategy, of command disconnected from the reality of the front, of blind belief in the racial, technical, and doctrinal superiority of the Reich. That confession of Göring's, dry and resigned, was more than a sentence. It was a tombstone. There, the last vestige of Nazi confidence in the domination of the air died. And in the weeks that followed, this ideological collapse would spread throughout the German military apparatus. Because if not even the sky was German anymore, what was left on the ground? In the next chapter, we will see how the enemy knew how to exploit this emotional breakdown with surgical precision. Air supremacy wasn't just used to bomb, it was used to suffocate. And the Mustangs, now lords of the skies, would go on to hunt down everything that still moved below them. There was a moment, still in 1944, when American pilots began to notice something strange in the missions over Germany: silence. It wasn't just the silence of enemy radios or the absence of intercepts. It was the silence of heaven itself. The radar indicated no approach. The Luftwaffe's fighter formations were thinning, and the German flak, once ruthless, fired late, inaccurately, when they fired. It was like flying over defeated territory that didn't yet know it. The Mustang, which had been designed to escort, began to operate without threats. Its pilots no longer flew to protect. They flew to patrol, hunt, and impose presence. And the most shocking, in many missions, there was no combat. They flew, attacked locomotives, bridges, supply columns, tactical targets, and returned unchallenged. This phase of the war, little commented on, is the most symbolic. It marks the moment when the United States won battles without firing a shot in response. They won by the simple fact of being there. The Reich, without fuel, without pilots, without parts, without a plan, just watched. A Mustang on the horizon was already a sentence, and it was no longer a novelty, it was routine. Luftwaffe reports from September 1944 revealed that in 70% of Allied deep bombing missions, there was no interception. That's right. 7 out of 10 flights took place without resistance, not because the Germans didn't want to fight, but because they couldn't anymore. The jail had been broken. Air supremacy had become an operational domain. Mustangs were no longer weapons, they were permanent shadows. And with them came bombers, photographic reconnaissance, night flights, drops of supplies to the resistance, sabotage operations. The Luftwaffe was on the ground, and what was still flying was shot down before it even gained altitude. The symbol of this is in the mission data themselves. While in 1943 the P-47s and P-38s lost up to 4% of their aircraft per operation over the Reich, the Mustangs in 1944 had a rate of less than 1%. This wasn't just the result of good design. It was the cumulative effect of a gear that had crushed enemy responsiveness. The war, at last, had become one-sided, and this one-sidedness was not just physical, it was psychological. German pilots avoided engagements, units refused to take off, and at some bases Mustangs were seen circling in provocative maneuvers, descending on empty airfields like lone predators surrounding an already resigned herd. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. From the beginning, the Germans knew that the danger was not only in the fighters, but in the production line. What they called technical invasion was already visible in 1943, but they ignored it. And when they realized, it was too late. If you are enjoying unraveling these facts and want to support this research and reconstruction work, like the video and subscribe to the channel. This is how we can bring more detailed stories with data, voices, and real context. The sky had changed, and with it, the war. In the next chapter, we will understand how American pilots, now absolute masters of the air, came to operate with their own radio codes, marking entire areas of Germany as denied areas. Because when a plane flies unopposed, it's not just flying overhead, it's occupying. Years after the skies of Europe fell silent, many of those who once crossed paths at supersonic speeds and deadly gusts have met again. But now, no helmets, no cockpits, no anger. At veterans' conventions, in hangars turned museums, at memorials on quiet lawns in Normandy or Bavaria, former American and German pilots sat face to face, not as enemies, but as survivors of the same storm. One such encounter occurred in 1971, when Johannes Steinhoff, a Luftwaffe ace, met Hubert Zemke, commander of one of the most effective fighter groups in the 8th Air Force. Instead of accusations, there was silence, then smiles, and finally a phrase that was marked in the transcripts: "You beat us with mathematics." Steinhoff was not just referring to the number of aircraft. It referred to the total equation: production, training, reach, reliability, support. German pilots, even decades later, still called the P-51 the perfect machine. The sleek fuselage, the high-altitude agility, the range that seemed endless, the robustness of the Merlin engine, all of this inspired not only fear, but respect. Erich Brunotte, another Luftwaffe veteran, once confessed that his first reaction to seeing a Mustang through the window of his FW-190 was one of admiration. It was too beautiful to be a weapon, he said. And when he met an old enemy at an aeronautical show in the 80s, they spent more than an hour discussing the design of the radiator. In these conversations, there was no vanity. There was precision. Memories of risky maneuvers, of chases at 600 km/h, of colleagues shot down and rescued, of radios sizzling, of fingers freezing on the stick. An American pilot said that as he approached a decommissioned airbase in Germany for a reconciliation ceremony, he felt more nervous than on any real mission. This time, I knew I would find eyes that I had already aimed at once, but now to see, not to shoot. At one such ceremony in 1994, veterans from both sides gathered in front of a restored P-51. All around, children played, tourists took pictures, and civilian mechanics polished the fuselage with care. One of the Germans, then in his late 80s, touched the aircraft's rudder and muttered, "This plane destroyed my squadron, but maybe it saved my life." because many later understood that the defeat of the Reich was not just an end, it was also a liberation. Without American wings dominating the skies, perhaps the cycle of destruction would have lasted longer. Perhaps the sacrifice would have been even greater. And in this bitter logic, respect flourished. Meetings like these have been recorded in documentaries, diaries, and biographies. They revealed that while war is waged by systems, it is waged by men, and even the most trained to kill recognize in the other a reflection of themselves. The Mustang, which once divided skies and overturned convictions, began to unite stories. It was common to see former enemies posing together in front of a restored example, like two old mechanics proud of the same machine. Because after the war, the function of remembrance was not to judge, but to teach. If the P-51 was a tool of supremacy, it also became, over time, a symbol of reconciliation, a reminder that even the most lethal technologies can carry human stories, and that sometimes survival is the greatest form of victory. In the next chapter, we'll look at how Mustang's legacy has gone beyond war, influencing generations of pilots, air doctrines, and even the way power is calculated. Because when a machine changes the course of history, it never really lands. It continues to fly in the memory of those who saw it pass. There are aircraft that win battles, and there are those that win memory. The P-51 Mustang did both. Its elongated fuselage, its tapered nose, the elegant curvature of the wings, and the visceral sound of the Merlin engine at high revving have become fixed in the collective imagination, not only as a vector of war, but as an archetype of superiority, aesthetic, technical, and moral. From the last months of World War II, when the first images of Mustangs escorting bombers over Dresden hit the press, to the Hollywood movies of the 1950s, the Mustang was no longer just a fighter. It has become a symbol, an icon of an America that not only won, but won with method. Its almost cinematic appearance was not accidental. The plane seemed to have been sculpted for speed. The polished metal covering reflected the light like a war mirror. When it flew in formation, it created a silver line in the skies of Europe that to this day remains recorded in blurry but eternal photographs. Museums around the world have preserved dozens of units, restored with almost religious obsession. Each unique bolt is a time capsule. Every technical detail, from the ventral radiator to the four-blade propeller, tells a story of precision. But what immortalized the Mustang was not only its performance, that's what he stood for. While the Nazis designed airplanes with futuristic lines and experimental weapons, the Americans bet on something more mundane: feasibility. The Mustang was not made to impress engineers, but to deliver results. It was the workhorse that looked like a thoroughbred. Its range was superior, its maintenance was simple, and its kill rate was increasing. And unlike the FW-190 or the ME-262, the P-51 didn't rely on miracles. It relied on planning. Pilots who operated it spoke of it with a mixture of affection and reverence. Many called it the weapon that brought us home. And in the skies over Korea, nearly a decade later, it was still flying. Because even with the advent of jets, the Mustang still fulfilled functions where agility and endurance counted more than pure speed. In parades, the sound of the Merlin engine became an emotional signature, a unique note that, when it echoed in the skies of London, Paris, or Washington, caused goosebumps. It was the sonorous memory of victory. Not by chance, American cinema has immortalized the P-51 in dozens of films. From 12 O'Clock High to modern productions like Red Tails, the Mustang is always shown as the silent hero, and even his adversaries, the few who survived, never disrespected him. Goering, Steinhoff, Galland, all at some point recognized his excellence. An airplane that shouldn't exist if it existed, that it shouldn't fly that far, but it did, that he shouldn't win so many times, but he won. And all this without resorting to solitary genius or cutting-edge technology. The Mustang was the triumph of chain work, applied engineering, and the logistics discipline. The design itself, studied by experts decades later, is still used in aerodynamics courses to explain the balance between resistance and power. The silver paint with a nose colored by Squad became a graphic symbol. T-shirts, insignia, tattoos, logos, all appropriated the silhouette of the P-51 as a visual metaphor for strength. But behind the brilliance there was calculation. Each curve had a function. Every inch of aluminum, a reason. Unlike the Reich's mystical prototype culture, the Mustang proved that what works is more powerful than what fascinates. And the irony is this: The most legendary plane of the war was, first and foremost, the most practical. The aesthetics of victory in this case was born from function, and that's why it flies to this day, not just in the skies but in the imagination of everyone who studies that conflict. The P-51 was a weapon, yes, but it was also an argument that in times of chaos, those who plan win. And in the next chapter, we'll look at how this argument reverberated for decades, influencing not only military aviation, but post-war power doctrine. Because when a symbol survives time, it becomes more than a machine. It becomes a reference. The P-51 Mustang was undoubtedly an instrument of war, but its presence in the skies of Nazi Germany revealed something much bigger, that conflicts are not decided solely by bravery or technology, but by moral, philosophical, and industrial decisions made years before the first shot. The history of the Luftwaffe, its withering rise and precipitous fall, serves as a wake-up call for any nation that confuses technical superiority with strategic invulnerability. The fundamental error was not in the engineering of the Bf-109, but in the belief that an elitist, centralized, and inflexible system could resist an enemy that learned in real time. The Mustang, on the contrary, was not born from a theoretical ideal. It was born from constant feedback, from tests with drivers, from adaptations made on the factory floor, from a culture that accepted that making mistakes quickly was better than making mistakes too late. And when America decided it needed a long-range fighter, it didn't look for the perfect plane. It looked for the plane that was possible. He improved what existed, adapted what worked, and built on data, not dogma. Germany, on the other hand, continued to design the ideal fighter as the sky collapsed. This philosophical difference killed more pilots than any Browning machine gun. The Mustang became a legend because it represented a generation of factory workers, engineers, mathematicians, and pilots who understood that efficiency wins over genius alone, and that quantity with quality, applied with purpose, is the deadliest weapon there is. It is impossible to look at the course of that war without seeing that the battles won in the air were previously won in planning meetings, in production reports, on assembly lines. What Mustang teaches us even today is that true power lies in the ability to adapt, in the humility to listen to the field, in the choice of replicable solutions. The aesthetics of his victory lie not only in his silhouette, but in the chain that sustained him: precision-refined oil, advanced runways under bombardment, redundant logistics, standardized training, signals intelligence, and modular engineering. The Luftwaffe lost the air war because it ignored this totality. He continued to bet on heroes while the enemy bet on systems, and when they finally realized, it was too late. In a world that today reinvents itself at an even greater speed, the lessons left by this machine of aluminum and fire still echo. Technical arrogance is a sentence, dogmas kill, and the ability to anticipate, not just react, is the new battleground. If there's anything more lethal than the Mustang, it's the culture that produced it. In the next and final chapter, we will see how this machine, which once crossed the skies to destroy, now flies as a reminder, not from the power of war, but from the responsibility that comes with victory. Because those who win intelligently have a duty to remember, so that it never happens again. At 28,000 feet, Major Hans Kogler was holding the stick of his Bf-109, but there was nothing left to maneuver. The sky over Berlin, which for years had been a sanctuary for German air superiority, was now torn by silver fighters that defied logic and doctrine. The radio, once filled with firm commands and combat cries, remained mute. The silence was absolute, and carried a weight greater than any cannon boom. That was not just a tactical defeat. It was the collapse of an entire structure of thought, the conviction that German technical genius, combined with the bravery of the pilot, would be enough to sustain an empire. The Mustang that morning did not only symbolize the range of a fighter, it was the metallic ghost of three-shift factories, of workers in Detroit, of engineers in Dayton, and of supply lines that began in the Pacific and ended on bombed-out roads in the Rhineland. Germany was not defeated in the skies. It was defeated in the decisions it made years earlier by underestimating the cold logic of scale production, standardization, and living logistics. The lesson, then, crystallizes with brutal clarity. In a protracted war, bravery is just the veneer. What decides the outcome are the invisible gears, the spreadsheets, the paper tanks, the miles of intact track, the barrel of fuel delivered on time. That's what the P-51 brought. Not a new weapon, but a new era. An era in which volume trumps maneuver, where systems defeat tactics, and where the invisible, what is behind the front lines, is the one who dictates the rules. And when, years later, a Luftwaffe officer declared in an interview, "We were defeated by trucks, thousands of them coming from all sides. We never stood a chance against it." He wasn't just talking about logistics, he was talking about vision, of a world that believed in steel, being overthrown by a world that believed in flow. If you value this search for historical truth, for the engineering behind war, for the invisible that decides everything, support this channel. Enjoy the video, subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact. And comment. Which data shocked you the most in this story? The impossible reach, the paper tank, the silence on the radio? Share your impression. It helps keep that memory alive. But don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.